Moved by the Honourable Senator Omidvar, seconded by the Honourable Senator Gold, that this bill be read a second time. On debate, Senator Omidvar.
Thank you, Speaker. Honourable Senators, I rise today to speak on Bill S259, the Frozen Assets Repurposing Act, which I will refer to as FARA. Before I begin to share the details of this bill with you, I would like to thank the originators and thinkers behind this proposal. They are the World Refugee Council, which was called into life 3 years ago by the Center of International Governance Innovation, or CG. It tasked itself to be a catalyst and to look at transformative and out-of-the-box solutions addressing one of the most significant crises in the world today, and that is the crisis of forced displacement, of the forcibly displaced people of the world, those who flee their countries for safety, and those who are internally displaced and cannot flee their country. I am a very proud member of this council, along with noted academics, former heads of states, former ministers, Nobel winners, and activists. The World Refugee Council released its report called A Call to Action, Transforming the Global Refugee System this January at the United Nations. It urges nation-states, regional organizations, and multinational institutions to do more than just talk, but take action. This bill is a direct response to that call for action. Repurposing frozen assets of corrupt foreign officials is one of their recommendations, and I am very pleased to bring it to you in the form of legislation today. I would like to thank Senator Andrzejczyk. As you all know, she was the one that spearheaded the Magnitsky Act through Parliament, and it is now law. That act ensures that foreign leaders do not find a safe haven for their ill-gotten gains, at least not in Canada. The bill that I'm speaking to today stands on the shoulders of the Magnitsky Act, and I, in turn, Senator Andrzejczyk, stand on your shoulders. They are slim, but metaphorically very broad. If S259 is called into law, Canada will be able to seize the frozen assets of corrupt foreign officials through court order and repurpose them to alleviate the suffering of the people who have been most harmed by their actions. In this way, it squares the circle. Why is this important? For one, the world is facing a forced displacement calamity. There are nearly 70 million people around the world. Half of them, colleagues, are children who have fled their homes because of armed conflict, violence, persecution, human rights abuses, including torture, sexual assault, and exploitation. This is the highest number of the forcibly displaced since the Second World War, and the numbers continue to rise daily. Over 25 million are refugees who have left their homes and crossed international borders, but another 45 million are internally displaced in their own countries. This has put a significant strain, especially on those jurisdictions who border these places and who themselves are challenged to meet the needs of their own citizens, let alone thousands of arriving refugees. Colleagues, as someone who had to make the decision to leave a country in the middle of the night, the decision to flee is never an easy one. It is fraught with peril, and frankly, it paralyzes you. I will never forget trying to pack the one bag. What should I put in it? Should I put books, photos, medicine? I think there's a bit of sanity in me that prevailed, and in the end, I packed the most important things, which was baby formula and diapers. I can still remember what it was like to cross the border from Iran into Turkey. From Iran into Turkey, yes. And I remember, I can almost smell still the fear that was pervasive in the room. It was our fear, of course, but there was also the fear that I sensed in the Revolutionary Guards who were surrounding us. But here's the difference. They were barely 14 or 15 years old. And they had weapons, and they had bayonets. And I think we all recognize what a toxic combination fear and weapons can be. I share this story with you because I want you to walk in the shoes of these people who feel their fear, feel their loss, and their helplessness. Senator Coyle so eloquently said today, no one leaves home unless the home becomes the mouth of the shark. I am, of course, one of the few lucky ones. I was able to come to Canada. I've had a very productive life with my family. But that is not always the case for the people who are forced to flee. The displaced of today live in squalor. There is little food. Fresh water is scarce. Disease and danger lurk everywhere. Sex and human trafficking are growth industries in such settlements. And resettlement, an option that we are rightfully proud of in this country, only applies to a slim 10% of the world's refugee population. It is countries like Bangladesh with the Rohingya refugees, Uganda with the South Sudanese, or Colombia with the Venezuelans who are most at risk. All have opened their doors to let people in. But this has put an enormous strain on them, on their communities, on their economy, and their social fabric. There's another reality that I would like you to consider. Forced displacement is no longer a temporary phenomenon. On average, it lasts 20 years. Whole generations of human beings knowing nothing more than living a protracted, uncertain life. So clearly, new streams of funding are necessary to deal with this growing need. As the World Refugee Council has pointed out again and again in its report, there is just not enough money in the system. Simply put, more funds are needed. The UNHCR, as one example, is only ever able to reach 60 to 65% of its annual budget. In 2017, at the height of the crisis, it actually only reached 57%. And these are not just numbers. I hope I'm not just painting a picture of numbers, but painting a picture of lives at risk. And yet, there is apparently a whole lot of corrupt money floating around. The World Bank estimates that $20 to $40 billion per year are stolen by public officials. But even more pertinently, it is estimated that corrupt leaders of countries with large numbers of refugees or of countries whose population has been displaced have deposited billions of dollars in cash and assets in foreign jurisdictions. It is reasonable to assume, in fact, it is reasonable to be certain that a lot of this money is parked right here in Canada. Let me describe to you how this bill would work. As I noted, Canada already has a number of sanctions regimes that permit the freezing of assets by corrupt foreign officials. There is the Magnitsky Act, there is also the United Nations Act, SEMA, the Special Economic Measures Act, and the Freezing Assets of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act. The decision whether to take the next step and seek a court order for confiscation would be made exclusively by the Attorney General of Canada. Only the Attorney General or someone else with the AG's consent could make an application to a provincial superior court. How would the AG come to this decision? The AG would be acting on behalf of the government as a whole and will no doubt have conferred with colleagues, including the Minister of Global Affairs. Clearly, he or she would be motivated by reports and documents, by the list of frozen assets that is already there, from other reputable sources, journalists, academics, fact-finding missions, etc., concerning the individual in question, their role in corruption, the impact of their actions on people, and whether they fall into the description of Section 6 of FARA. The AG would then make an application to the court. The court would decide, based on evidence, if the confiscation should proceed. The court would give notice, would hear witnesses, weigh evidence, including from representatives of the foreign official. And the court would make a decision based on the balance of evidence. If the court decides that the assets should be confiscated, then it would also, in the ruling, set out the criteria and the plan for the distribution of the assets. The court would decide to whom and how the assets should be distributed. Should they go back to the country of origin or not? Should they go to the UNHCR or another recognized NGO like Médecins Sans Frontières? Should they go, in fact, to the neighboring country that is dealing with the massive influx of refugees? The court would also decide on the means to monitor the implementation of the order, thus providing accountability and transparency. Let me give you a practical example, make it real. Canada has already frozen the assets of the military generals in Myanmar who committed a genocide against the Rohingya and forced 1 million people to flee to Bangladesh. Canada, through the court, will be able to confiscate their assets and repurpose them to help the Rohingya that are currently in the refugee camps in Bangladesh. The court could decide whether the money goes to Bangladesh, whether the money goes to an NGO or another entity. That would be the court's decision. Another example is Venezuela. The UNHCR has said, and this is a stunning factoid that I would like to drive home to you, 5,000 people left Venezuela every day in 2018 in search of protection. All told, that's 3.4 million people that have left since their crisis started. And I'm sure we can imagine how this sudden influx is straining the host communities in Colombia and Peru. Canada has already frozen the assets of President Maduro. If this bill is passed, the courts would be empowered to confiscate those assets, repurpose them to help Venezuelans in need, whether they are in Colombia or in neighboring countries. As well, the court would also decide to whom the funds should be dispersed, how they would be dispersed, and how the accountability would be ensured. And the same example could apply to South Sudan as well. The names of 2 warlords are currently on the list of frozen assets, so it would be, if this bill is passed, the law would apply to that context as well. I hope the principles of this bill are apparent to you. The first principle relates to accountability. Dictators, human rights abusers, kleptocrats have acted with impunity for far too long. They need to be held to account. They purloin the wealth of their nations, leaving a trail of victims in their wake whose lives are devastated. As the World Refugee Council has pointed out, in considering accountability, it is important to remember that forced displacement is often the result of bad governance. Violent and oppressive regimes, or those that fail or refuse to protect their own people, are responsible for much of the forced displacement in the world today. These are very often the same regimes that are corrupt. They steal from their treasuries and place their money and other assets offshore for the unlawful benefit of the rulers and their associates. The second principle is justice. By seizing the assets and repurposing them back in support of those whose lives have been immeasurably harmed, destroyed perhaps for a lifetime, perhaps over multiple generations, I hope you will see the moral symmetry at play here, and I hope you will appreciate it. Actions have reactions, and there must be consequences. Without consequences, we are left with words full of sound and fury, signifying possibly nothing. The third principle is due process. This bill proposes that the seizure of assets of corrupt foreign officials take place through court order. Only a judge will decide, based on the balance of evidence provided to her or him, whether or not to proceed on this matter. Only a judge will decide whether or not the seized assets are returned to the source country or to another jurisdiction. In this way, the bill makes certain that political motivations for seizing assets are removed. This requirement adds transparency because the application and evidence will be public, the hearing will be open, and the results with reasons will be published. In addition, a court hearing will ensure that anyone who has a potential interest in the frozen asset can come before the court and make their case. The fourth principle is openness. Canadians and indeed the world will know through a public registry not just the names of the foreign officials, but also the value of their frozen assets. The fifth principle is compassion, but compassion with an edge, with a heavy dose of pragmatism. We can empathize and sympathize with the victims of displacement, but they need housing, they need safety, they need healthcare, they need food and water. All of this costs. As detailed by the World Refugee Council in its report, the UNHCR is not able to meet the growing needs of the growing numbers of displaced people. By repurposing stolen money back to those who have suffered the most, this bill will create a new source of financing and providing urgently needed resources for the victims of this unfortunate phenomena. That is compassion, but linked to effective action. And finally, this bill is about good governance. Canada should not and must not be a safe haven for ill-gotten gains. In this chamber, we're looking at other avenues of hidden corrupt money, such as Senator Weston's inquiry into beneficial ownership. This bill sends a strong message to corrupt leaders. You or your money are not welcome in this country. This is not a place where you can hide it or grow it. Colleagues, some have asked whether the courts are in fact the right vehicle for this bill. To that I offer two responses. First, the courts have the expertise to deal with such matters. The courts are regularly called upon to deal with the issues of asset confiscation, albeit in different circumstances. Currently, the courts oversee the confiscation and distribution of proceeds of crime from drug cartels, gangs, and/or other criminals. My second observation is that the involvement of the courts will guarantee openness, impartiality, and fairness. The courts are well positioned to provide considered and just solutions and to oversee a transparent and accountable process. Some of you may be thinking in your minds the million-dollar question that we always ask: if this legislation conforms to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Let me quote from a policy paper published on this question by the World Refugee Council, which was prepared by a noted lawyer, former Attorney General of Canada, and former Canadian Ambassador to the United Nations, Alan Rock. The section of the Charter that could potentially be invoked to attack asset freezes and confiscation is Section 7, the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. Although this section has been held by the courts to be very broad, the jurisprudence has also made it clear that Section 7 generally does not protect and apply to the economic rights of the applicant. Justice Gagné ruled in a case involving the freezing of assets of former President Ben Ali of Tunisia, and she noted, quote, "Generally, neither the right to hold employment nor the economic interests of the applicants are protected by the Charter," unquote. The paper concludes on this point. It is unlikely, therefore, that an applicant would be successful in challenging Canadian legislation providing for the freezing and confiscation of assets of corrupt foreign officials on the grounds that it contravenes the Charter. I would like to point out another very important aspect of this bill. Currently, we do not know the value of the assets that have been frozen in Canada. We know whose assets have been frozen, but we don't know their value or, in fact, their nature. There is no public transparency since the government is not obliged to provide this information. This bill will raise the curtain, will make it less opaque, and will compel the government to not only list the corrupt foreign officials, but also to provide the value of their assets. In the absence of this information, Canadians are not able to advocate for confiscation, and opportunities to achieve the benefits of FARA may be lost. Finally, I would like to tell you that this legislation is unique, but it is not unprecedented. In 2015, Switzerland enacted the Foreign Illicit Assets Act. Under that law, the Swiss government can apply to their federal court to confiscate foreign frozen assets. If granted, Switzerland can send the assets to the country of origin or another entity for the purpose of improving the lives and conditions of the inhabitants of that country and supporting the rule of law in the country of origin, and thus contributing to the fight against impunity. Both the United Kingdom and France currently are looking at this legislation, at similar legislation as well. So this brings me to my final reason why I believe this legislation is important. If Canada succeeds in passing it, I believe that others will follow. We followed the example of the US in calling the Magnitsky Act into life, and Senator Andrzejczyk improved on the US version once it came to Canada. The same narrative could well follow this act. This bill, I believe, will ignite the imagination of other jurisdictions by providing a very concrete example of how we do it. Others will pick up on it and improve on it. This can and will be transformative, and it will start here in Canada. In conclusion, colleagues, for far too long, corrupt foreign officials have acted with impunity. They have not only stolen mass wealth, but have created significant hardship for their people. Their actions have contributed to the displacement of millions of people that continue to grow daily. The principles that this bill is based on, the principles of accountability, justice, due process, openness, compassion coupled with pragmatism and good governance, will ensure that words lead to action, that action leads to consequences. Calling them out is not enough. We have to make them pay. And FARA will accomplish precisely that. Thank you, colleagues.
Good.